All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Millennials Are Old podcast. And you know what, Brian? I've been thinking, right? We always talk about, obviously the maladies of the world, right? And just all the awful things that happen in it. But, a place that is famously, especially recently, not had any tragedies or violence happen is New York City. Would you agree with that, Brian?
Well, it's Disneyfied. It's perfect. It's a utopia because of Giuliani. We all want to live there. We all strive for it. Yeah,
Yeah,
NYC, baby. Love it. Love the Mets. Let's go. I'm walking you.
exactly. But, we were talking about video nasties. Of course, we reviewed a video nasty this week, Brian. And there is a movie, arguably the first video nasty, that featured a just completely unrealistic view of New York City, which was ugly Italian men in the 70s murdering people. That just didn't
Oh, you
happen.
mean Deep Throat. You're talking about Deep Throat.
Yeah, I'm definitely talking about Deep Throat. Very much the
Lots
very
of ugly
same.
Italian men in that movie.
Yes. But this ugly Italian movie involving murder is called Driller Killer. Are you familiar with it, Brian?
I am. This is a movie that I like and everybody else seems to hate, to be honest.
Well, you know who really hates it, Brian, is British censorship authorities. So I think with our intro out of the way, I think that's the perfect intro to get into this episode, which once again is The Driller Killer. But before we get into our review this week, Brian, as always, let's bring back our segment, Cringe Generational Cringe Millennium Moment of the Week. Yes, so once again, let's get into this, Brian. But before we get into it, you have a great segment for us.
So this week, because we're talking about grimy New York media, we're talking about a film that involves the early punk scene and the kind of the griminess of it, the poverty of it, just the grossness of it in New York. I want to talk about a millennial icon. He himself is technically Gen X. Well, not technically, he's Gen X. His influence, though, is on millennials, and it's huge. I want to talk about Scott Sturgeon, also known as SZA Crack. Do you know much about SZA?
I know about Leftover Crack. Is that who this is?
Yes, it is. Leftover Crack are, you probably know if you're listening, it's an incredibly influential band on like kind of 2000s and 2010s punk. They're also very of their time. They couldn't have existed any more time. They're kind of based and they're kind of cringe, both thematically and musically. Musically, they have like this melodic epitaph skate punk thing and then ska horns, and it's kind of like, all right. And then they kind of do some grindcore stuff and black metal stuff. Very weird brew of influences, and it all kind of worked at the time. Lyrically, anarcho-syndicalist, a lot of allusions to Michael Parenti and to Noam Chomsky. Also a lot of LaVey and Satanist stuff, and a lot of edgelord school shooting type Unabomber stuff. But that made them very accessible to a lot of millennials. It kind of brought in a lot of, I guess, kind of hot couch guys who maybe wouldn't have been exposed to this anti-homophobic, like anti-sexist, anarchist, whatever band. So that's as far as their connection to millennial culture. They're one of the preeminent punk bands, I would say, of that time. They're kind of like our generation's Dead Kennedys. And that's not to say they're as good as the Dead Kennedys, but that's kind of the space they occupied. And kind of the space SZA occupied was that of Jello, this really kind of sanctimonious, but kind of aspirational and really annoying guy. The thing with SZA is he's kind of a piece of shit, as far as we know. Massive drug addict, which I don't care about. I'm doing drugs right now. But so is the name Leftover Crack, not like a bit. They did a lot of crack for a period of time. Again, I don't care about that. SZA has always been really volatile. There's lots of stories. You'll see him pushing around kids, screaming at kids at shows. Shit that kind of sucks, but it's also kind of standard, like kind of punk rock guy stuff. And it's kind of like, you're like, oh, okay, if you went to see Leftover Crack, you kind of knew there was a chance that SZA was fucked up and he might be kind of shitty. I'm of the school of thought that that's sort of something you accept. Maybe accept's not the right word. It's something that you can deal with if you're into punk rock of a certain type. In 2019, however, SZA's former partner, who was a member of the band Days and Days, who are one of the worst fucking bands I've ever heard in my life. That's not relevant. It's not a nice thing to say, but Days and Days suck. In 2019, she started talking about SZA allegedly being physically, verbally abusive to her. There wasn't a lot of evidence to support this, and I'm not saying that she's not telling the truth. I don't have anything to back it with, but we do know SZA was like an angry, kind of shitty guy in general, just because so many people had seen seen him be an angry, shitty, generally unpleasant guy. Took about 2 years of these stories circulating, I think, for them to really have an effect on Leftover Crack and Stizza's career. Around 2021, they start getting kicked off of festivals, dropped by venues. And at some point, I think in 2023, Stizza and Heather both make statements that, hey, they're getting along now, they've reconciled, they're going to stop talking about each other. And I'm kind of thinking, and I don't listen to Leftover Crack anymore. It's kind of embarrassing now. And I've found cooler punk bands that are more underground. As I've gotten older and kind of moved away from Wisconsin, I've got more access to punk. I don't have to listen to Rise Against and Leftover Crack anymore. But I'm kind of okay, so Stizza, I guess, is done. He's just going to hang out and live off residuals from reissues, because Leftover Crack were on some pretty big labels. They're on Hellcat, they're on Fat Records, and Alternative Tentacles. In early 2024, Stizza announces a new Leftover Crack album with a whole new lineup, plus him, and a new tour. And me and pretty much everyone else, I think, that was a punk nerd, was expecting this tour to flop and be almost like a punk trapped tour, right? But that doesn't happen. He books pretty big punk venues around the country, and they all sell out. He is currently selling out almost every show he plays. Because again, Leftover Crack are a core punk band, but a lot of people like me that grew up around this music of a certain age, we saw, and for a lot of people, maybe they did radicalize us or bring some cool musical or political ideas to our attention. I wouldn't necessarily say that for myself, but I know a lot of people like me who do say that. And then a lot of people who aren't into punk, a lot of metalheads and a lot of kind of edgelordy guys and guys that like to party and drink a lot, they also go to Leftover Crack shows. So people are psyched that Stizza's back. And the collective response to well, what about this stuff with Heather seems to be sort of a shrug. I'm not necessarily going to moralize about that because, again, I don't know what happened. I'm not there, and I don't know either of these people. But it's kind of funny that there was this brief moment in 2021 where collectively as a community, the whole subculture decided Stizza's bad. We've had it up to here with him. We're done with him. And he just had to kind of stop talking for 3 years. And he's having probably the most successful tour he's had since the late 2000s right now. It's going to be a hot spot for elder millennials, I could tell you. LC are coming to my town in, I think, early January, and I'm sure it's going to be fucking popping. I bet you half the punks in the city are going to be there. So if you're an old millennial and you're looking to meet some elder millennial crust punks, I would check and see if LC are coming to your town, especially if you want to meet some elder millennial crust punks who have contradictory attitudes about how women should be treated in private and public.
Well, yes, you're talking about elderly millennial crust punks. Let's talk about elderly boomer crust punks, because I think that's what this movie is. I think it's an elderly crust punk movie.
It's proto crust punk.
So once again, this is Driller Killer. It came out in 1979. It was not rated in the US. And, to talk about the video nasty thing, this is arguably the first video nasty. It was the thing that actually literally started the video nasty moral panic, because the British distributor Vipco had a full-page ad in some mainstream magazine, which was the scene where he's drilling the guy in the head, and that just fucking just did the wave of controversy after this. So it was banned in the UK until 1999. It was finally released uncut in 2002. So this movie was banned in the UK for about almost 20 years.
And immediately out the gate, we have an example of, not that we need to put too fine a point on it, everyone knows, but how stupid and kind of fake-ass that type of moral panic is. If you look at the video nasties list, you've got Driller Killer, you've got our previous inductee, Night of the Demon, and then you've got pretty popular movies like Evil Dead, and it becomes really apparent that none of these movies really have anything in common, and in fact, that the people that compiled this list probably had not seen many, if any, of the films they were complaining about.
I think on the last episode, totally art film. But I think on the last episode, I mentioned that Mary Whitehouse claimed she never saw any of the movies on the video nasty list.
Yeah,
and there's 72 movies, 72, and she claims to not have seen any of them.
That's so awesome. It's so awesome to go through life with that kind of confidence.
Yeah, it's just fucking ridiculous. Oh, another trivia fact I had here. So the title of this movie is mentioned in the song Nasty by the band The Damned. So I think that's kind of interesting as well.
Yeah. And there is some overlap with The Damned's aesthetic and the aesthetic of some characters in this movie. I don't know if that's intentional or if maybe The Damned just saw the characters on screen and thought, hey, that looks kind of like us. But it's an interesting point.
Well, when we get to the band in this movie and who they look like, trust me, we'll definitely have some things to talk about on that, because these are some 70s looking motherfuckers. I'll just say
they look so great. They look so great.
We'll talk about people who look really good. This movie was directed by Abel Ferrara. It was written by Nicholas St. John, and it was produced by Rochelle Weisberg. And, we mentioned Abel Ferrara, who we will certainly have a series about one of these days because he is a fascinating filmmaker. You may not like his
Love him.
movies, audience at home, but he's a fascinating filmmaker.
Abel Ferrara is part of a kind of, I'd say what it has become sort of a tradition for us and the filmmakers we follow. He's part of this lineage of like somewhere between the art house and the grindhouse. He's trying to reconcile these two extremes. And of course, we've talked about other people that do that. He does it in a particularly visceral way, I'd say. He really...
You know how I describe him as, Brian?
A lot of obsessions. Yeah.
I would describe him as the grindhouse Scorsese. That's the best way I can describe him in a lot of ways.
Yeah, no, he is very Scorsese coded. Even in this film, I think you can see kind of the ghost of Taxi Driver hovers far and wide over Driller Killer. Not plot-wise, but just tonally and thematically.
Okay, so Brian, you can tolerate in this movie Taxi Driver, but you can't tolerate fucking Joker, Brian. That's really hypocritical of you. No, I'm fucking around.
I mean, we can do a Joker episode someday if you really want.
No, we won't. We won't. After the second one, there's no reason to ever review the Joker, I'm being honest. Like, that movie just completely destroyed that franchise. But you know what? We're talking about franchises, right? So he directed such films as Miss 45, Fear City, China Girl, King of New York, Bad Lieutenant. And Bad Lieutenant is a movie we're going to review at some point because we're going to team it up with the sequel. Because they are completely different movies and they're both batshit insane.
We'll do Bad Lieutenant for sure. We'll probably do Miss 45 eventually because that's a fucking crazy movie.
Oh, I read some of the details and I'm like, wow, he did that. He did that.
Yeah. Yeah.
They were talking about Body Snatchers. He did a loose remake of Body Snatchers in 1993, Dangerous Game, The Funeral, and ever since 9/11, he claims, he moved to Italy after 9/11 due to censorship reasons, but he's lived in Italy for like the last 20 years. He's made a bunch of films there that no one's ever fucking heard of. But I wanted to include that on there because he's only made films in Italy since like the fucking turn of the millennium.
So Abel Ferrara, just to give a little bit of context for him, pretty fascinating guy, as you said. Ferrara has themes that he is obsessed with. And it's kind of interesting, even in this film, which is a very rough 16 millimeter, like art house Warhol film disguised as a like exploitation horror flick, you see those themes crop up. He's got obsessions with like paternalism. He's got obsessions with Catholic guilt. With
so much Catholic guilt.
And it's so explicit. And it gets more explicit in his later films.
I mean, the movie literally starts with Catholic guilt.
And it's literally our introduction to the movie. And another important Ferrara obsession that I think he doesn't get enough credit for is he really has, I think, a pretty sensitive view of the experiences that women go through in society and the abuses that women suffer. I don't really see people talk about this a lot, but a common thread in Ferrara films is how like the humanity of women is stripped from them. And he doesn't shoot like, I mean, his films are rough. They're hard to watch. It's not like watching a movie like, I don't know, some movie that would come out now that's like really inspirational and kind of cutesy. But I think he looks constantly at the way that victims are treated and the way that they respond in human ways and the way that abusers act in realistic ways. I've always thought this about Ferrara. I think that even comes through in Driller Killer to an extent. And I never ever see people talk about it. I see people talk about Ferrara as some weird chauvinist and like pervert. And I just don't see it.
In all honesty, Brian, I'm kind of kidding, but that might just be anti-Italian discrimination, if I'm being honest with you. Because he is an unattractive Italian man, like Italian-American.
Yeah,
there might be something there.
What's cool about, maybe, people just assume that he couldn't be talking about those issues.
Yeah,
What's
totally.
cool about Driller Killer is that he leans into it, and he kind of plays like, I mean, my read on Driller Killer right, is that it's about like a hack yuppie who's like, best days are behind him, right? Like a John Travolta wannabe artist.
No, yes. And then, we mentioned people who are involved. So Nicholas St. John is a screenwriter who literally has only done Abel Ferrara movies. They were like friends since high school or something, and he worked on a bunch of his movies for like 20 years. And he actually wrote all of Abel Ferrara's movies except for Cat Chaser and Bad Lieutenant from 1976 to 1995. So very involved with Abel Ferrara, of course. And then Rochelle Weisberg, just real quick, she only ever actually produced one film, which was 9 Lives of a Wet Pussy, which is a softcore porn film?
Ferrara's that's hardcore, and it is Ferrara's debut.
And that was the golden age of porn, though, right? Like when it was still
Yes.
like attempting to be cinematic.
Yeah.
Correct?
So you're going to think I'm joking. We should review some of those movies sometime because they are interesting as fuck. Yes.
Are you talking about things like Deep Throat or like Behind the Green Door and Nine Lives of What, like stuff like that, maybe?
Deep Throat's kind of boring, to be honest. I mean, it's very influential, it's important, but it's kind of boring.
I'm a pervert, but I'm going to be honest, I've not seen it. I'm going to be honest, I have not.
I mean, like Behind the Green Door, a pretty interesting movie to talk about. Maybe if we do like if we ever have a Patreon, maybe we'll talk about smut someday, because that'd be pretty cool. But so Ferrara's whole thing, right, is that he started making films in the 60s as a kid. Like he was playing in a garage band, and then they'd shoot little films on like his dad's like reel-to-reel or whatever. And then that evolved into him spending more time making movies. And he literally says, and I think this is actually a pretty common story, Ferrara's just more honest about it than a lot of low-budget filmmakers who went like, well, I wanted to make a movie. I wanted to burst into commercial filmmaking. And I thought, what's the easiest thing I can do right now to make money? Well, it's porn. Like, I'm a pretty good filmmaker. I can probably make a pretty good porno. And from there, he goes, well, what's the next easiest thing to do? He said, well, it's Texas Chainsaw Massacre. They made it for like $3,500 and they made like $40 million.
No, exactly. And then, so this movie is about 96 minutes long officially, but the version we watched today was 101 minutes long. And this was only found out, I want to say in 2019 when they were re-releasing this film on Blu-ray. Arrow release, yep. And Abel Ferrara didn't even know this version still existed. So technically speaking, it's 101 minutes, but the version that the vast majority of people have seen was 96 minutes. And it had a budget of about $20,000, and it did not have a listed box office, because I'm sure this movie was not probably released in a wide format.
It played grindhouses, probably played some drive-thrus. You can imagine, I think, I talked last episode about how a lot of these 70s, like, kind of exploitation horror films, they promise a lot of salation, a lot of action and gore, and when you see them, they're really boring. This film kind of is both of those things. I wouldn't say it's a boring film. It's kind of crazy, but it is not the type of, like, salacious, like, gorehound flick that people might have assumed it was.
No, totally, 100%. We'll certainly get to that in the plot synopsis. But yeah, this movie is, in my opinion, pretty tame for a 70s, like, grindhouse movie.
It's like Ferrara using the Texas Chainsaw Massacre template as, like, an excuse to launder in all of the shit he wants to talk about.
Well, and to be honest with you, like, it's one of those things where if those scenes hadn't existed, to be honest, I don't know if anybody would have seen this movie. I'm going to be honest with you.
Yeah, because it's like, it is like a weird art house character study. And it's almost like the horror, as loosely as you can call it, the horror elements, the killings, they kind of are like little stakes holding this movie into the ground.
Well, that's the thing, like, how many of these, like we talked about with, fucking Night of the Demon, although Night of the Demon, obviously, is a movie that they really went all in on the gore kills in that movie, but how many of these, like, movies back in the day were like, oh, we have a loose idea for a story, but we're gonna put, like, one fucking crazy scene in here that everybody's gonna want to see. Because otherwise, if they hadn't put them in, nobody would see these fucking movies, because they're mostly boring, shitty movies. To be fair, I do not believe that about this movie, but there's a lot of movies out there.
No, but that's the thing. This movie, Driller Killer, does that thing that we're talking about, but it's done by a talented filmmaker, is the difference. Yes. He's doing that exact same thing, but he has, like, things around it that he wants to say, and, like, things he wants to explore.
A guy who is a critical darling for this kind of, like, movie style. Like, to be honest with you, like, critics seem to like him and his movies a lot. And then speaking of, this movie actually has a 64% critic score and a 32% audience score, which I'm kind of surprised the critics and audience score is that different. That's kind of crazy to me.
Well, to give some anecdotal kind of insight into that, I got this movie in high school. It came in one of those, I always bought, we've talked about before, the big public domain horror DVD box sets. I had read a little bit about Driller Killer, and that I had read the title, and I knew the name Abel Ferrara, and it came in one of those box sets. And I was like, oh, it's that movie Driller Killer. And this is when I was 15, 16, so I'm getting really into 70s punk, early 80s punk. I'm also really into gore. I'm just getting into weird shit. And for me, I, like, fall in love with this movie. It's in the middle of all these cheesy horror movies, and I'm going like, what is this? And I start showing it to all my friends that are into horror, that are into punk rock, that are into trashy things. And every single one of my high school friends, even my really hip ones, go like, what the hell is this? Like, nothing's happening. There's these weird improvised scenes with this shitty band. Like, and I'm going, no, this is amazing. Don't you guys see it? And it was like we were watching different movies.
Well, speaking of watching different movies, I think it actually leads perfectly in here because I think our interpretations might be a little bit different. Now, to be clear, I like this movie, but I think our interpretations are going to be slightly different.
Okay.
So the movie begins with artist Reno Miller, played by Abel Ferrara. Once again, maybe one of the craziest looking leading men in a movie I've ever seen in my entire life. He looks insane in this movie. He's like
Yeah.
scrawny. He looks drugged out. He looks insane from the get-go. He's crazy looking.
He looks like a real life drug addict and not like a movie drug addict.
No, he does. He does really fucking hard. It's wild. Like, just even looking at his eyes, I'm like, you have the scariest eyes I've seen in a long time.
Intense performance, to say the least.
It is, yes. And to be fair, Abel Ferrara seems like a very intense individual. I mean, to be fair, he's chilled out a little bit in more recent interviews, but back in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, he was a very intense man.
Yes, famously.
And his girlfriend in the movie, Carol, played by Carolyn Mars, enter a Catholic church and approach his estranged derelict father. The derelict seizes Reno's hands, causing him and Carol to flee from the church. Unknown to Reno, his father slipped him a piece of paper. The father requests a meeting with Reno. Reno denies knowing the homeless man. And that's how this movie starts, by the way. It starts with, literally a Catholic fucking parable here about a callous, lustful man ignoring the plight of a homeless man in a church.
A man denying the father in a Catholic church to pursue his selfish life.
His what? This is the second movie he ever directed, and this is how Catholic it is. Immediately.
Yes. Incredible.
The Pope couldn't be less Catholic, couldn't be more Catholic if they made a movie.
Oh my God, when you see Bad Lieutenant, you are gonna fucking shit.
I am so fucking excited for Bad Lieutenant, because I've only seen Bad Lieutenant 2, and I sent you that clip last night. Did you watch it?
Yes, I did.
And by the way, that is, I would say, maybe my favorite scene from the movie, but the entire movie is basically that batshit insane. It's incredible. I think it's literally one of the only movie sequels that's actually quite a bit more acclaimed than the original, but obviously
people liked it.
Bad Lieutenant a chance. Well, to be fair, it's made by Werner Herzog, so I mean, that's,
yeah,
he's the king. Remember when he got shot on TV and he was like, oh, it's fine. And somebody shot him in the stomach and he still did the interview. He was like, it's fine. I'll take care of it later.
Talk about intense directors, man.
Oh yeah, Werner Herzog's also very... That's the thing though, is that's the reason why I think Bad Lieutenant 2, works so well, even though they're two completely different movies, that they're both made by deeply intense, both European weirdos.
The third Bad Lieutenant is going to be made by that guy that did Antichrist, Nymphomaniac. I hate him. I hate that fucker.
Oh yeah, Lars von Trier sucks. I hate Lars von Trier. He's terrible. Remember when he did an interview where he's like, oh yeah, I'm a Nazi. And he just was like...
Is it the same one where he kept calling his mom a whore?
I think so, yeah. He's a fucking weirdo, dude. I don't like him.
Yeah, fuck that guy.
Oh, God. Later in his apartment, Reno receives an electricity bill and a phone bill, both of which, along with his monthly apartment rental fee, Reno cannot pay. He shares the apartment with Carol, a former flight attendant, and her drug-addicted lesbian lover, Pamela, played by
They have a
Baby
very
Day.
Portland relationship.
They do, yes. They have their polycule. They're in a really grimy living situation. And also, just like Portland, Brian, nobody has an ass in this movie.
Nobody has an ass. Nobody has a job. The polycule thing is interesting because I see a lot of people make fun of it in reviews, and I don't know if it's people who've never known people in relationships like that, but I actually think pretty well observed in this film, the weird dynamic of it.
No, totally. And it's one of those things where Reno is, of course, fetishizing it, but also he's, kind of distant from it at the same time. It's very interesting.
The actual emotion is, between the two women. Reno kind of centers himself in it, but it's he's distant from the actual feelings of it, yeah.
And then also the trivia fact I had here is she was a high school dropout runaway stripper in real life, and this was the only role she ever got. I think she got paid a couple $100 to get drugs, which you could tell because she sounds strung out the entire movie when she talks.
Yeah, there are times when you can tell that she's reading off of a card and she's sounds like she's falling asleep. Her performance is fine. For this movie, it's fine, but it is noticeable that she is not super enthused with the project. I did find myself, this is going to sound callous after what I just said. I kept thinking, I wonder if someone did her hair or if that's just what her hairstyle was like at the time of shooting, because she does have a cool style in this movie. She does look like a woman that would be hanging around the 70s, punk no wave scene pretty authentically.
No, this movie is late 70s New York City punk to the core in every single way. It's really awesome. It is such a timepiece. I love it.
Yeah. I mean, I think in the
Was this the first punk movie, in all honesty?
Not quite, but it was one of them. It would have been one of them. There's a movie in 77 called Punk Rock Movie that's mostly about the UK scene. And there's some things, some earlier art house things. It's all shit like this, very art house stuff. And actually, this film, I have kind of a pet theory about Driller Killer. I think it's kind of has some of the no wave scene rubbing off on it more than like the classic Ramones Dead Boys punk scene, because it's got this kind of like really confrontational, avant-garde, kind of impenetrable aesthetic to it. Like the editing is really cold and it's really jarring and it feels really kind of harsh to watch, which to me kind of reminds me of kind of what was going on in New York in the rock scene with bands like Teenage Jesus and the Jerks and Theoretical Girls and shit like that.
Fair enough. And then Reno visits Dalton, played by Harry Schultz. And I say the names because, of course, I want to give him credit, but literally Abel Ferrara was the only person who ever did anything after this movie. So, but I still want to give them credit. And he's an art gallery owner and announces that he is currently painting a masterpiece. Reno asks for a week's extension and a $500 loan to cover the rent. By the way, $500 back then was like $30,000. I'm kidding, but that was a lot of money back then. However, Dalton refuses because obviously if you saw this man being like, yo, I just need an extension, you'd be like, no, you look like you're on drugs.
Like a painter? Like, no.
No, absolutely not. However, if Reno finishes a satisfactory painting in 1 week, Dalton will buy it for the agreed amount. The following day, no-wave band The Roosters begin practicing their music in a nearby apartment, which makes Reno unnerved and frustrated, needless to say, because, listen, all right, I don't care how strung out you are. Nobody wants to live next to a punk house, okay? Nobody does. That sounds miserable.
So, this is where my kind of read on the film, well, part of my read, I think, starts to take form. Reno is a guy who probably thinks of himself, from what little we know of him, as pretty hip, right? He probably thinks he's pretty edgy and counterculture. He's got his fucking curly kind of feathered hair and his stupid gold chain, and he does his stupid paintings that are like nonsense, and he thinks he's gonna make lots of money off of them, right? And we're getting into like the late 70s, so guys like this have been kind of existing and had their moment for a few years. And his paintings, we've kind of been directed that his paintings maybe were selling at one point and they aren't now. And while this is happening, he's stuck living next to this punk band. And it's like gnarly fucking, like not musically gnarly. They're not actually that good. But just this nasty group of guys who are probably a little bit younger than him and are kind of more hip and comfortable with the grimy stage of their life that Reno is trying to get out of.
Yeah, it's, there's obviously a lot of these kind of individuals in media, right, where they just think they're just such fucking hot shit, but they're just such squares. And instead of realizing that, and I think kind of like growing up a little bit, they just get like angry and fucking bitter about it. And in this movie, obviously, he goes on a murder spree.
And it's tied to like, I mean, we'll get there, but it's tied to like his failure as an artist. And it's tied to, I think, like his feeling of like resentment towards his roommates and, ostensibly his sexual partners who connect more with each other than with him.
Well, and that's the thing, he's ethnically Italian. He should have went to fascism. He should have veered towards fascism. Because all failed artists veer to fascism.
You could argue that because he's brainwashed by corporate advertisements into loving a power drill, maybe he is.
That's true. And also eating McDonald's from the fridge, because we will certainly talk about this. His culinary choices are disgusting in this movie.
This movie is so gross. This movie is so nasty. It's like smells bad to watch it.
It smells like 70s New York, like piss and fucking used food.
It smells like panties that have been worn for 3 days permeating through the air. And you're like, what's that smell?
Well, speaking of things that are horrible and smell bad, at 2 a.m, Reno becomes agitated by the music while painting. After having a vision of his own image saturated in blood, that's definitely not Catholic at all, Reno goes out for a walk. He sees an elderly homeless man sleeping in an alley, seizes him and begins ranting. Reno ducks into the alley with the man when they see teenage gang members chasing another homeless person. When the gang members are gone from sight, Reno drops the man to the ground and walks away, vowing that he will not end up like that. The next day, Reno complains about the Roosters to their landlord. However, the landlord refuses to act since the music does not bother him, which is awesome, by the way, because that's not what a landlord would do. Well, the landlord would tell him to shut the fuck up and pull a gun on him.
The reality of that scene, I think, is probably that the Roosters are making some money, right? Because people are going to their shows. They have a record. They're like these hip, and Reno hates them. He clearly like doesn't know what punk rock is. He hates it. He thinks it's talentless. It's garbage. And they're like, he's hearing from his roommates. He's hearing from their performances downstairs. People kind of like the Roosters. They're probably paying their rent, and he is not.
No, he is not. He's being a fucking weird bum.
Well, bossing around his girlfriend that is paying his way.
Yeah. in that his landlord gives him a skinned rabbit for dinner. Reno takes the rabbit home, repeatedly stabbing it during the preparation.
Well, I think that's the rabbit we see earlier, right? I was thinking about this last night.
Oh, I didn't make that connection, but probably.
Well, like nobody ever says it. I was even reading about this because we see him feeding a pet rabbit earlier in the film.
Yes. Okay. I don't know how the fuck I missed that, but I think you're totally right.
Nobody sees it. Yeah, I think it's the same rabbit. Sorry, I didn't mean to.
No, it's all good. During a reprieve from the music, Reno hears voices calling his name and has a vision of Carol with her eyes gouged out. Once again, not Catholic at all. That night, Reno leaves his apartment and heads outside armed with a power drill connected to a portable battery pack. He discovers a homeless man inside an abandoned building and kills him. The following evening, Reno, Carol, and Pamela see, and this is just an incredible character name, Tony Coca-Cola. By the way, to be clear though, the 70s Luigi.
Yeah, he looks like our boy. He looks like our sweet boy, and we love them both. So just quick rundown of Tony Coca-Cola and the Roosters. Fake band.
By the way, Dead Kennedy's ass band, like, member name.
Yeah, Tony Coca-Cola that is like a Chips punk rocker name. Fake band. Don't bother trying to look them up. One of the cool things about Tony Coca-Cola and the Roosters is, so you'll see them described as no wave. Musically, they aren't quite there to me. I think it's more just like they're not very good at their instruments. Like they sound very dissonant and jammy, but I don't think that's because they were trying to be no wave. I think they really just aren't very good at playing, but it's awesome. Tony sings in this weird falsetto, which I'm sure he's doing to sound as annoying as possible. He wears this white face paint a lot, kind of like a Lon Chaney monster. The other guys in his band have this huge New York Dolls hair. It's a type of band that absolutely existed for like a brief period of like 3 years in the 1970s. It's so cool.
Well, if I'm not mistaken, too, wasn't the New York Dolls involved with this movie, too? Like, at least one of the members was.
Dave Johansen is friends with Abel Ferrara. Got to see an early cut of the film.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So after the show, and by the way, Reno does not like the show very much, clearly, because the next scene he goes on another murdering spree, and this is where the infamous one happens, where he like drills a guy in the back who's being annoying at a bus stop, you know. Definitely an annoying guy on public transit dying. That's not relevant to New York City at all recently.
Or forever.
Or also, of course, the infamous drill in the head, which, by the way, I think is maybe the only moment in the entire movie where it's like, okay, I can see why this was controversial, but otherwise, no other death in this movie is really that violent. It really isn't.
Actually, most of the violence is pretty unclear. I wouldn't say it happens off screen, but it's definitely not graphic the way that this is.
No, it's really like the one, I don't know if quite call it a walkout moment. I would say it's fairly close to a walkout moment.
Yeah, I mean, it's not to me and you, but I guess if I'm seeing this in 1978, seeing a drill go into a guy's skull while he's alive, pretty rough. Could be a walkout moment.
Totally. So after this rampage, he goes to sleep. Later on, Tony visits Reno's apartment to ask Reno to paint a portrait of him. In exchange, Tony agrees to Reno's demand of $500 to cover his overdue rent. And also, this is the scene where he eats the most disgusting food on the planet, which is refrigerated McDonald's. We need to talk about this. It was disgusting. And seeing his weird fail fridge is like incredible. It's so hot couch in the most gross way. I hate it. He's got like peanut butter in the fridge. Get that shit out of the fridge.
This is a thing that I think is to some degree intentional on Ferrara's part. I've seen a lot of people talk about how gross Reno's living condition is, how gross he is. I don't think that's an accident. The McDonald's, watching him eat the cold McDonald's from the fridge does make me want to gag. It's so bad.
And also he downs it with a open can of beer and milk.
He's such a nasty guy. And I guess being generous, there's a part of me that thinks like, oh, is it because like, I don't know, it's funny because Reno as a character, he thinks so highly of himself, or rather he thinks so little of everyone around him. He thinks so little of his romantic partners. He thinks so little of his landlord, of his neighbors, of these people who he's obsessed with not becoming, who he's murdering, who have done nothing to him. And he's like an absolute scumbag. He's just absolutely disgusting.
He is just a bad man. And also, once again, we have to talk about this pizza. That is the grossest looking pizza ever created. It's like wet.
It's wet. It's wet. And I think, like, did they get a gross pizza intentionally? I looked for, like, as I watched some interviews with Ferrara before this, I was looking to see if he said anything about the pizza in any interviews, and I can't find anything.
The one thing I think is that he either went to a place that he knew was shitty, or he ordered the most disgusting pizza he could think of, like a vegan pizza with no cheese and extra sauce or something. It looks awful.
It's slop.
It's slop. But literally every Midwest pizza looks better than that. Every single one.
We're going to make a remake of Driller Killer where for this scene, Reno orders Altoona style pizza.
I literally had pizza in Moline, Illinois that was better looking than that. That's how bad the pizza looks.
This is also another scene with Reno berating his girlfriend or, his roommate, his partner. I don't think the word girlfriend is ever used, but that's more or less their relationship. And I want to say, I've seen people talk some shit about Ferrara's performance as the leading man in this. I actually think he really captures in a pretty unsettling way, the intensity of, an abusive person. The put uponness and the muling and scolding. I think that really comes through in a way that you don't see a lot in this type of cinema.
No, 100%. Yeah, he is just a detestable individual is the best way I could put it. In every single way.
And it's just so not only is he not nice to these girls, they're also, one of them is literally paying his way because he's not making any money. One of the earlier scenes in the movie when our two female leads are hanging out, we don't really know at this point that they're all in a kind of polycule and they're having a lesbian relationship, but it's sort of being established there. And one of the girls says, well, why don't you go out, and get away from Reno sometimes and do things with your friends? And she says, well, I don't have any friends, because that's the situation that these people are in. They have been sucked into Reno's orbit and he is all they have and he does nothing for them.
Just like an abuser would. Like an abuser would. But yeah, so as Reno paints, Tony poses by playing his guitar and kissing Pamela. An upset transient man in a nearby alley is later killed by Reno, which is another awesome scene, by the way. And also he has the screws put into his hands, then he's killed. Also, once again, not Catholic or Christian at all. Afterward, Reno completes his painting, then wakes up and notifies Pamela and Carol. The next day, Reno and Carol show the painting to Dalton, who leaves after declaring it unacceptable. Carol yells at Reno for sitting with a blank facial expression, which results in her leaving Reno for an ex-husband, Steven, played by Richard Howarth, the next morning. Also, I love the scene when she's really just upset with him and just finally is the last straw and screaming at the art collector guy or whatever, because she uses some very no-no words. Which
she uses some very
70s.
Some very 1970s New York language there.
Yes. She's like, you moron! No, she doesn't quite say that, but that evening, Reno calls Dalton and invites him to see another painting. When Dalton arrives, as the Roosters are practicing, a dressed-up Reno kills him with his drill. There's so many... this movie's called The Driller Killer. He does kill a lot of people with his drill.
Not a very effective weapon, I will say.
No.
So when Reno is dressing up here, it's a little... So there's a lot of, I think, themes going on in this film that I think are pretty well done, but are sometimes maybe a little confusing. I'm pretty sure that when he dresses up, he's trying to dress like Tony Coca-Cola, or he's trying to be like him. He's this thing that he doesn't understand, that, clearly people like more than him, that is more successful than him, that is more artistically successful, more commercially successful. And in this moment of revenge against the art dealer who has scorned him, he is well, I'm going to be Tony Coca-Cola now. I'm going to do whatever I want and ascend to that.
No, totally. So just finishing up the plot here. After visiting the Roosters, Pamela returns to the apartment where, upon the discovery of Dalton's body inside, she flees to the hallway before Reno grabs her. Across town, Carol is back with Steven at his apartment. She takes a shower while Steven prepares tea. Reno enters the apartment, kills Steven, then hides his body behind a kitchen counter. Exiting from her shower, Carol walks to the bedroom where Reno is hiding underneath the bed covers. She turns off the lights, gets into the bed, and tells Steven to come here, with obviously the implication that he's in the bed and he's gonna kill her.
Yeah,
that's how the fucking movie
so upsetting. It's the most frightening part of the movie.
It is 100%. And I think I was reading too that was kind of a last minute decision, if I'm not mistaken. It was meant to end a little bit more definitively than that. Obviously we know what's going to happen, but it was a little bit more definitive than that, if I'm not mistaken.
But it ending that way is so perfect because you think that she's gotten her happy ending for a second. You think okay, Reno's gone crazy and he's killed Pamela, but our other girl was strong enough to get away. She was able to see that moment coming or see something coming and know it was time and left. Of course, that does not happen because Reno finds letters that she had received from her ex-husband with an address on them.
That's why you never rely on the post office. Just deliver everything without a letterhead.
We should have let Trump dismantle them.
That'd be great if Trump's Listen, I watched this movie, The Driller Killer, right? And the killer got, of course, the letter with everything on it. And he found the girl.
And he ruined the lady's life. He ruined the lady's life because they sent the letter. And she didn't need the letter. She just needed the money.
Oh, God. But, speaking of things Trump loves, Brian, before we get to our final thoughts, I have a couple Amazon reviews. Now, I'm going to be honest, Brian, most of these Amazon reviews are fucking terrible. They're boring and uninteresting. But I have a couple funny ones here. I sometimes have insightful ones, but this one's mostly funny. So I got 3 here. So the first one here is from Nightwolf, who gives us 5 stars. And the header of the review says, "This movie was bad." So 5 stars. This movie was bad.
Okay. The thing is that, that could be an interesting perspective on this movie because it's such a weird kind of choppy movie, but we'll never know.
The body of the review says, "The movie was really bad. I had to turn it off, but it came in fast and it was in good condition."
Great. We don't even know where he ordered it. We know he ordered through Amazon, I suppose.
I assume so. This is the first one I've ever seen. 5 stars. This was the worst thing I've ever watched. What the fuck?
He's giving a positive review to Amazon shipping services?
I'm guessing. That's the first time
dude.
I've ever seen that specifically. That's hilarious, honestly. We've obviously seen plenty of "I love this movie, but the shipping was bad" 1 star, but I've never seen the opposite.
I'm curious because why did he order this film? It's like a horror nerd, like a horror collector wouldn't write a review like that.
To be fair, this movie was written by Nightwolf, so I guess he had to go back to doing a fucking fatality against Scorpion. That's what I'm guessing. And he's like, "I'm going to watch a movie real quick to get some ideas on how to do more fatalities." That's what I'm guessing.
He was not impressed by the Driller Killer fatality.
No, he really wasn't. But speaking of people who should also be Mortal Kombat characters, so Ian Larson gives this 3 stars. And the head of the review says, "Brilliance of the unintentional kind." And I don't agree with that at all. I think this is a pretty intentional film.
I mean, you could argue, I think there are things that are a consequence of it being a low-budget kind of guerrilla filmmaking exercise, but I don't think it's, unintentional. I definitely don't think it's like an Ed Wood movie.
No, absolutely fucking not. There is definitely some intentionality here, but I'll give him a chance, obviously, to explain himself. So, in the body of the review says, "I was one of the many Brits to run out and get this film as soon as the ban had been lifted, expecting it to be an amazingly gory and violent horror film. Whilst I was disappointed in that area, the film still satisfied me immensely. It has to be one of the most inept and pretentious films I've ever seen." I don't agree with really any of that. I don't think it's inept really at all.
I think
pretentious
you could,
maybe, but not that much. I don't think it's that fucking pretentious.
You could argue that it's pretentious. I get why people would think that. I don't really think so, but I get it. I don't think it's inept. I think it's a very, well done, very low budget, independent film.
No, 100%. The plot and characters have absolutely no substance. The performances are beyond bad. Well, the performances are bad. Well, I mean,
the performances
they're serviceable. They're serviceable for the kind of movie it is, but obviously they're bad because they're one and only time actors, and one of them was literally a drug-addicted fucking stripper.
As far as the characters not having any substance, I just don't think that's a fair characterization. I think our main character is really unpleasant and nasty, but I definitely think that he's kind of thought through. And I think that the other characters in the film, his girlfriends are pretty. I mean, we don't get to know them very much, but I actually think that their relationship with each other and their kind of the situation they're on is pretty humanely depicted.
No, I agree. Ferrara has created something that me and my friends just love to sit and laugh our heads off at. It's obvious that he intended all his monologues to be deep and profound, but they're just side-splitting. And it's maybe he intended them to be both? Or one or the other? I mean, I don't know what to tell you.
No, because this movie is meant to be funny. There is a level of, kind of absurdity and satire to this, for sure.
Oh, of course. If you don't notice that, I don't know what to tell you. You're just not good at analyzing art if you don't think that. I'm sorry.
Well, but also, if you're watching this with the hopes that it'll be like The Room or Troll 2, you're in for kind of a disappointment. Is it side-splitting? Because is there anything that's that funny in it, even if it's...
Well, you think a Brit would get dark and bleak humor and dry humor. You think a Brit, of all people, would understand that.
Well, we've been overestimating the British for centuries.
That's actually very true. We've been overestimating their ability to be good at anything, especially...
To be human.
Yes. I mean, look at their food. Jesus. Then, speaking of people who are barely human, so our last review here is from Rex, who gives this 1 star. And the header of the review says, "Waste." And the body of the review says, "Waste of time, yours and mine watching it. Waste of time, waste of bad actors, film crew somebody might pay them. Waste of bad writers, a very bad written movie. Cut your loses and save 1.5 hours of your life. Change the oil in your car and actually be doing something even if it's snowing outside. It's more productive than watching this movie. It says at the beginning of the movie to watch it loud. Yes, to keep you awake until the drill goes on again to wake you up. Sorry to the bad actors and writers. Go back to high school, get your GED, and get a real job.
Wow, what an asshole. Damn, man.
Maybe you should go to high school because there's a lot of grammatical erers in this review that I had to
put the fries in the
through.
bag.
No, he would say, put those fires in the bag.
Put the fries in the bag.
So yes, this quasi-illiterate man ends our Amazon review section. So before we end the episode here, Brian, do we have any final thoughts for our technically first video nasty?
So this film is, if you're into, I'd say, cult horror, if you're into like exploitation films, I would say this movie is pretty essential. If you're into like punk rock history, it could be pretty interesting. I wouldn't say it's essential to like fans of punk rock unless your interests specifically overlap with the stuff in this film, but it does provide a snapshot of the kind of grimy New York punk scene, or at least an approximation of a snapshot of it that still isn't really depicted in film all that much. If you are coming in and you're expecting a Texas Chainsaw Massacre or even like a gnarly Night of the Demon type video nasty, you might be disappointed. This is a character study. There's only one, as Taylor said, there's only one really explicit violent act in the film. It's very heavy on like symbolism and psychology and kind of dry humor. And what's I think interesting about that, as I said, is like the video nasty list is pretty incoherent. The people who made it clearly had no interest or knowledge about what they were talking about. Because if you look at Driller Killer and Night of the Demon, I mean, there's nothing really connecting those movies. Except for the fact, again, that they were two independent horror films that were released on video.
I mean, that's the thing about the video nasty era, right? Like, it went from everything from Cannibal Holocaust, which I would say is a pretty morally reprehensible movie in a lot of ways, to stuff like at one point on the ban list, although it wasn't actually banned, but it was investigated, was the Dolly Parton movie Little Horror House. Was it the best little horror house in Texas?
The best little horror house in Texas.
Because they thought it was a porno. But that's the thing, it was so incoherent. There was just no...
It had Dolly Parton in it.
They were talking at one point, and I said in the last episode in the 90s that when they were expanding the censorship, that things like Schindler's List would have been banned. Like, they were just banning everything, or at least attempting to ban everything. Like, there was no artistic, like, license or credibility or, like, just anything. There was no scrutiny. There just was nothing.
And the things that are on the video nasty list, they include, this is like an art house horror film. Whether it's good or bad, I enjoy it, but I understand that some people don't. I think your mileage may vary. But then, like, Night of the Demon is like a low-budget gore film. Evil Dead is a video nasty, and it's a pretty accessible, kind of like funny, gore-heavy romp that has some pretty gnarly gore in it, and one particularly nasty scene. But there's no cohesion here, because the people making this list hadn't watched any of these movies. They had seen advertisements for them, or in some cases, I suspect, heard the film's titles. Do you think anyone that compiled the video nasties list even knew what Cannibal Holocaust was about?
Nope. They were like, oh, a Holocaust and people were eating each other? That's probably what they fucking thought. Let's be honest.
Two bad words? No good.
Yeah, two bad words? No thanks.
Which Driller Killer and Evil Dead also are two bad words titles.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. And obviously we're against censorship of pretty much any variety outside of obviously extreme edge cases. But like, it was just crazy. And Britain at the time was by far the most censored Western nation for film. Like, they banned everything. Like, it was crazy how much shit they banned.
Just holdovers from puritanical cultural bullshit.
No, 100%. But yeah, so my final thoughts on this film real quick. Of course, I like this film quite a bit. Obviously, Night of the Demon and this movie have really nothing in common, so I'm not going to compare them. But I will say I think this is obviously a better film. It's obviously, I think, a much more culturally important film. Like, I think the snapshots of, like, I would even argue, like, at the very bare minimum, like, proto-hardcore punk, because obviously, like, hardcore was not featured in this movie, but hardcore was formulating as a musical movement around this time. But seeing that from like that kind of awkward like original punk era of like 75 to 78 and then even until like 79 or whatever, like you didn't really see a lot of that, as we talked about earlier, in movies. So seeing that was really special to me, especially the New York scene. You just didn't really see a lot of that. So seeing that was really cool. So just also seeing the griminess of the 70s New York City, like of course that's been kind of romanticized by like a lot of hipsters and stuff like that, but it did in a dark way. It seemed like kind of a magical time for artistic expression. So I have to give them credit for that. And this is just another, I think, piece of media from that time that looks anachronistic to us now, but has obviously been incredibly influential to like modern period pieces. I mean, the Joker kind of fucking showed this, like seriously, to a certain extent, featured in the fucking Joker. And that was the highest grossing R-rated movie of all time, showed this kind of aesthetic to a certain extent.
That's so insane to me. Abel Ferrara actually said in several interviews he had some sort of moment when he was, preparing to make this film where he thought, oh, I'm in New York. I have all of this world, this just sleazy world at my disposal. I have to make it like a character in the film. Like he had some sort of moment where he was like just looking at people, probably people with problems, probably, on the street and going like, oh, this is like the city I live in. This is, what I've surrounded myself with, which you could argue is maybe kind of tacky and exploitative, but pretty interesting artistically, I think.
No, and like that's the thing, right? Is that when this movie came out, like 1979 was like one of the worst years for crime in New York City. Like thousands of people were murdered in New York City every year from like the 70s, 80s to early 90s. Like obviously we're joking about Giuliani or whatever, and Giuliani had nothing specifically to do with it. But like crime in New York City from the 70s, 80s, and 90s was like borderline apocalyptic. So showing that in this movie, just this grimy, gross world of like, yeah, just violence and coercion and obviously like just disgusting hipsters, or like what the 70s and 80s versions of hipsters would be, like violence against the unhoused
junkies
and stuff like that. Junkies. Just one of the early scenes of violence in this movie is just some random guy walking in a park who gets stabbed in the back. Like seriously, It's amazing how like this movie does show the griminess of New York City in a way that's interesting but not really romanticized. So I like it a lot.
Just documented
Very much so. It's almost like, guerrilla documentation to a certain extent. So I really appreciate that. But no, honestly, like I said, I like this movie quite a bit. Abel Ferrara, once again, is one of the most insane looking leading men in a movie I've ever seen, and I appreciate that. He is definitely not Hollywood. I mean, he makes Tom Atkinson look like a heartthrob. Like, he is just a weird, creepy looking man.
He is a crazy looking guy. He is a guy that if he sat next to you on the bus, you would get up and move.
Yes. Oh, yes, but we do recommend this movie 100%, and we will continue on, of course, the Video Nasty series for at least one more entry. And Brian, once I tell you about it after recording, you're going to be like, what the fuck is that? And then you're going to watch it, and you're going to be like, they really banned this movie. And I'm going to say, yes, they really banned this movie.
Oh, no.
It is but that's the thing, it's so... I'll talk about it later, and we'll watch it. Trust me, it is a movie that you're going to be like, they really banned this bullshit. And I'm like, yeah, they did. They really fucking did. But before we get into that, let's get into our pluggables now that the episode's over. So once again, you can follow me at Carlos Chantor on Twitter.com. And as always, please follow us on both our YouTube and our Spotify channel, where we are uploading every episode simultaneously to both platforms. And as well, please donate to our good friends Scott, Shaw, and Robert. They're making a fantastic series. It's on YouTube. I'm now linking the episode in all the descriptions here, but they have a 10-part series that they want to complete. They need more moral and financial support to get the rest of the 9 episodes out. So please support our good friends. And of course, as always, as we say on every episode now, if you donate to the campaign, just send us an email, post a YouTube comment, just show us proof, anything that you donated to them, and we will, within reason, match your donation to the campaign. So like $20-25. So please, of course, donate to the campaign. And as of last episode, and of course, we're going to release this in like January or something, so who the hell knows where this case is going to be by then. But I did also link the unofficial Luigi Mangione campaign. He needs, obviously, a lot of moral support. He's doing just fine financially. His family's worth tens of millions of dollars, but either way, he needs our moral support to help, stick it to the shittiest CEOs in America and give them just even 1% of the fear that they give to us every fucking day. So please donate to the campaign. We want Luigi to end up as great as he possibly can at his fucking trial. Like, really.
Literally anywhere he ends up is going to be better than we could have expected this time a year ago for someone that this would happen to. Anything that we can do, even just, like I said, I don't actually know if there's much that any of us can do monetarily, but even just as a show of solidarity, anything we can do to kind of move the needle or at least move public opinion further in this case is, I think, a win for us and hopefully for Luigi himself.
100%.
So you can follow me at JLo Biafra on Instagram and Threads. As well, please follow Millennials Are Old Pod, again, Instagram and Threads, and Millennials Are Old Podcast on Facebook. Please reach out to me with any cringe generational content you find. If I see any virtue signaling Gen Xers, if I see any Puritan Zoomers, if I see any soy millennials like Taylor here, we will feature them on the show if they are funny enough or if they upset me enough, and they probably will.
Yes. Well, that's the thing, Brian, you just called me soy, and that's correct. I eat a lot of soy on a daily basis. It's one of my only sources of protein as a vegetarian, so I am, by definition, pretty fucking soy. But yes, speaking of soy, though, Brian, let's be honest here. Abel Ferrara looks like he consumes a lot of soy in this movie, to be
He is
honest.
so soy. Well, yeah, he's an art house director who's like, hey, I'm making movies over here. I'm making really intellectual movies, intellectually stimulating movies.
He's like, me thinks I'm going to kill some homeless people? No, I'm kidding.
Ah!
Yeah, as he kills the homeless people, goes, ah! Like, he just, like, just imagine, like, him, like, pointing at a dead homeless person and doing, like, fucking soy jack face.
Yeah, this is going to be our remake of Driller Killer, the one where he eats the Altoona pizza.
By the way, do you think that if Luigi had went to an Altoona pizza place instead of McDonald's, he would have got caught? Or do you think he would have killed himself? He's like, man, this is my life. I got to kill myself before the police catch me. Like, my life is falling apart. I got to eat Altoona pizza.
I see people online saying that Altoona pizza is better than it has any right to be. I've never tried it, but I see it a lot.
It's the fucking Kraft singles. I'm sorry. Like, listen, even if it was American style cheese, but it was like shredded, I could imagine. But that cheese is made to not melt. It's just not suitable for pizza cheese. I'm sorry. It just isn't. As somebody who is a bit of a pizza guy, as there was a Pizza Guys episode of Guys recently, but I can't handle it. I can't do it.
So bad. And it's green peppers, right? Green peppers underneath the Kraft singles.
Green peppers and salami. Yeah.
Oh, God, that makes me want to gag, but I need to try it someday. Someday I'll try it.
Well, that's the thing, Brian. When you go meet your family, you'll drive like an hour to Altoona and see if that works.
All right, we'll do it.
I don't think it's that far away from Pittsburgh. Or like, well,
no, I think it's doable. It's doable.
Yeah, you could do it in a day trip easily and try what is arguably one of the most hated varieties of pizza in America.
I just need to see, because I see so many people like contrarians online going, it's actually pretty good. It's just an acquired taste. And I'm like, what is it like? Well, I need to try it. I need to know.
Just the plasticky American Kraft singles. I just don't know how it could possibly be good. I'm going to be real here. I just don't know.
Well, and salami with that sounds so gross. Like, I know it's pizza, but that's salt, man.
I mean, it has to be better than the pizza and fucking Driller Killer. It has to be. There's no way it's worse.
The pizza in Driller Killer looks so bad. I don't know what's going on. It's like he dumped a bucket of hot water on the pizza before serving it.
He's like, this pizza looks okay, but I got to make it look gross for this movie. Let me dunk it in the toilet real quick. It's the Jim Gaffigan bit of dunking the Hot Pocket in the toilet. The toilet
pocket? Whatever happened to that guy?
I think he became like Trapcast or something. Oh, he probably
I think he's like a Zionist lib.
Jesus. Oh, God. But speaking of things that aren't Zionist coded, I'm hoping, that is the end of our podcast here. So have a good night, everybody. And just like Abel Ferrara in this movie, we need a good night's sleep because I'm looking a little crazy in the eyes. I'm going to be honest with you.
Truly.
All right. Have a good night, everybody.